Oh, and hello again. Let's talk about another interesting topic with regard to landscapes. And that's not something like this, but it's kind of inspired by this. What I'm talking about is sudden spikes, sudden elevations, sudden changes in elevation, and especially along the profiles on mountain hills, mountains, slopes. When you look against the sky, you don't want to see a perfectly smooth surface. You want to have a little bit of a jagged ridge or jagged line, due, of course, to rocks and also to trees. So what I'm going to do is explore some of the techniques for adding something that might look like trees, at least for far away. It's like for a random looking population of trees in a mid-range or distant range, maybe even close, up close if you later paint on them or do some further compositing. So to keep it very simple, I'm going to start with something like rendering some sort of a pattern like gems, something like this, very large gems. And let's see what we have, subscale. Let's just leave it like that. Okay, so we have something like this, and then we'll even smooth it a little bit more. Let's go and blur that with the good old Gaussian blur, and there you go, something like this. So you can tell this is going to be some sort of a rolling hill scenario, right? And in fact, we'll make it less contrasty. So we'll go to adjusting the value and reduce the contrast so it's almost all at the same level, perhaps a relatively dark level, because that's going to be the elevation map and we want it somewhat low in elevation. Now we'll also want to have an area where it's a little bit higher elevation. So let's do something like this adjustable linear gradient, or let's take the circular gradient. And by default, the gradients we see here, if we look at the sweep editor, it's going to show you what your currently selected gradient is. And so it goes from black to white, which means if we want to change the mode, we can multiply that, something like this in multiply mode. So we can go from the upper left diagonal to the lower right and have this multiply from black to white. The white parts will leave the current color unchanged. The dark parts will make them even darker. And so that's a good way, a quick way to have sort of a gradient in that elevation. And essentially we still have those bumpy hills, but they start dark and come gradually to higher elevation. We can now also do something like expanding the dynamic range. So we have some areas that reached full brightness and we have areas that are still very dark. We can still use that same tool to do this one more time and perhaps have a bit more of a flat valley at the bottom, and then it goes into the hills and eventually it's very high peaks. All right, now we might also want to make this something like seamless. Let's do that. So we have a little bit of a repetition capability here. We can use this as a tile several times, for instance in the Puppy Ray renderer. Let's go save this, or at least store it in memory. We might want to get back to that. All right, so the topic here is how to add trees, or let's first look at it without the trees. If we don't have any trees or any extra displacement of that elevation map, what might that look like? If we go to Puppy Ray, whether it's the GPU or the CPU version, we should be able to see. Let's go and turn on some more parameters and turn the water off. Right now we don't need the water plane. Let's do a quick refresh. It's very dark. Let's enable the global illumination. It's still dark, and that might be because we either have a very low value or we have a dark coloration in the swap image. Right, depending on what I did in the past, I may actually have a fairly dark coloration on the swap image. And I think for this exercise, I don't want that. So I'm going to undo this. I'm going to switch to the swap image, and yep, sure enough, we have some other images there still from a prior session. I'm going to store that. I don't know, I might need that later. And then I'm going to clear it. There, so it's all white for the color. For the texture, I can go back here, and now we have our elevation map. Now I'm going to go back into Puppy Ray GPU. There it is, and do another quick render. So now it's much lighter. Now we see what we wanted, those rolling hills, and we can take the camera rotation, look around, see the sun in the back, see the sky, and we have those rolling hills. We turned the water off. If the water plane is still on, we'll see some lakes or oceans. But really what we probably want to focus on right now is just the elevation map itself. So let's go and turn the water off. We can always turn that back on a little bit later. So what I want to do is add some trees, and basically do that, or simulating that, by faking the trees by simply having little spikes, a little triangular, or some sort of a triangular spike or little bump going up, and it's easily painted on the elevation map. Right, so I'm going to go store this just so we have a view of the current scenario, and then I'm going to go back to that elevation map, and essentially what I need to do is simply add a little bit of elevation there. Right, so there's one way to do that that's quite easily ready for it, and that's with one of the brushes. Of course, any brush really could be used for that, even a single brush or the airbrush. If you make a small airbrush, or some sort of a starry structure with a little bit more of spikes going sideways as well. In fact, there's a really great technique, which is you use the erosion and then pick a portion of that. Let's go take a look at that. If I use this stylize erosion and I get some erosion maps, these are perhaps a little bit too long. Let's do fewer of them. Let's make them not quite so long. But what you'll see is that you'll possibly get some areas with some starry structure. Not so much in this one. All right, so that's perhaps not the technique yet. But you can expect to see that sometimes to be an interesting way to then grab a portion, like with the selection tool here, the lasso, to grab a portion of that and make that the image that you want to represent a top-down view of the tree. Right, now you could actually also just do that. You could paint the top-down view of a tree, or to go and fake it in a very simple way. You simply use one of those preset brushes, such as, for instance, effects or organic effects. These have some starry. This one, organic effects, has a couple of interesting shapes. The starry one in particular, if you paint that, you can see it's got a little bit of a starry look. There's too many of them too close together, so there's a couple of things we need to do. One is under the settings, let's go pin this down. Under the settings, increase the distance, the step distance, so that we don't get them too quickly. Right, they're a little bit more sparse now because we have to move a bigger step with the brush stroke to actually see another one of those. The opacity also is not full. You see the opacity is halfway. If we go full, it's going to be brighter, but that's not necessarily what we want. We want to elevate the tree not to this brightest, highest elevation. We want to elevate it a little bit off of the current ground, whatever the ground is, right? If the ground is pretty high here, the trees are still going to grow by the same delta, by the same amount. So it wouldn't look right to be this bright in the dark area and then not much brighter or the same brightness in the higher elevation of the mountain, of the height map. So what we really should do here is to do sort of an additive mode. I think we already are in additive mode. There it is. Yep. So we want to be in additive mode, but then the amount by which we add should not be quite that pronounced. So the opacity should really be much less. Then we have a better chance to add only a little bit of elevation here, and it's visible. And then when we go here, it's still visible because it's adding on top of what it already has, right? And here too, it keeps adding. Now, at some point when you're already at the highest elevation, it might not make much of a difference. Well, so it's going to look like the trees are actually not growing that much taller or higher in those high elevations, which incidentally turns out to be pretty much what's happening when you go over the tinder line, over the elevation at which the trees even get to grow. Yes, I know, I need to reconnect my drive. All right, so so here we go. What I'm going to do now is simply paint the trees in the lower elevation, wherever it's dark. Right, so I'm going to go paint around here and around here, and that will populate some spokes like these in mostly the dark areas, because that's the only place where I'm painting. Now, if you're not quite sure how to select that, one thing you could do is simply go to the selection mask and do a selection by color key, for instance, and select the dark areas. perhaps give it a little bit more extra leeway here. Hue saturation value, maybe you base it on just the gray value, and then go around where you want. For instance, let's say you don't want trees in the darkest, deepest part, you don't want trees in the very highest parts, but you do want trees somewhere here in this mid-range, on the flanks of the hills, basically, right? So now that's a very crisp decision or selection, and sometimes you want to blur that a little bit and allow it to go a little bit off. So under the selection menu, you can go to the box filter or the Gaussian blur selection and allow that blur selection to spread a little bit outside too. And then that way you'll have some smaller trees as it fades away in the higher elevation, and also some smaller trees down low. And it's possible that this part will be flooded with water anyway, so we don't really care so much what's going to happen here. But now that we have this selection mask, first of all, we might want to get back to it. So let's go and select Store Selection, so that way you have a quick way to restore that same selection mask in case we need to do that. But the most important thing is you can go to the Paint tool and simply paint over that, right? And you know it's not going to paint outside of the selection. So that's the beauty of having that selection mask. Now these are relatively big trees, big blotches of higher elevation. You might want to make a few smaller ones, but more dense together. So step distance reduced, opacity reduced, a little bit like this, and the size reduced significantly, right? You want really small ones. In fact, even these guys probably are too small. Let me do an undo on that, right? So let's do first the small ones. And you see here they're barely visible, but if you zoom in, you can see there's a little bit of graininess being added, and that's going to make for a nice little alteration of shrubbery. Maybe we can make them even a little bit more opaque. There you go, so they're even easier to detect and see. And we're just painting essentially over the elevation map here. Right? We don't see that in 3D yet, but we know that the elevation map will elevate it into 3D, and those starry spikes will essentially produce something that looks a little bit like trees if it is properly colorized to be dark green. Well, that's taken care of from the swap buffer side. The swap image will contain the coloration for the green grass and the green trees on top as it's getting elevated. Let's go make a few bigger ones. Let's make something like step distance a little bit sparser, right? A bigger distance between the trees, and then a little bit more opacity and a little bit bigger size as well. Actually, the opacity we can probably keep down low. That's the size, that's the opacity. Let's bring it down, something like this. So now we have a couple of bigger trees as well. Those bigger trees are going to be higher elevation, and so they show a little bit at a bigger impact if you want. And if you want, you can make a couple of really big ones, because as you're experimenting, you need to sort of get an idea of what's the right size for this. It depends a lot on, it's relative to the terrain map there itself, right? You don't want these trees to be too small, but you also don't want them to be massively big unless you're doing something like Kings Canyon or something like that, and you have some really massive trees growing in the deeper valleys. So I think we have an interesting map here. Let's go clear the selection, and we see it looks very different from what we used to have. The smooth rolling hills are still out there. Now one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to replace that map and turn my attention to the outside of the selection. So actually I can invert the selection and replace that, or if I didn't invert it in the stored copy, if I still had this, I can, after I loaded it, I can load or invert the selection, and I might actually want to store that as well, simply so that I have two selection masks that I can easily distinguish. But in this case, of course, it's just one being inverted to the other, so the difference between the two is not significant. Wherever I stored that, I seem to have it off screen, but it doesn't matter, we can easily use it from there. So if I replace this, if I invert this and put it there, now I have my attention to the outside higher elevations, and here the darker lower elevation. And let's say I don't want to work on this part, I just want to work on the outside. Well, it's easy to simply turn this back out to the non-selected areas too. Right? You can paint on that. In fact, you can go to right click and select paint on alpha with maybe a blobby or a soft brush, and as you paint over that, you're either adding to the selection with the left button, or with the right button you're removing from the selection. So that's another way to return this part to the selection, to the non-selected region. And now you have, if you get the alpha, actually let's do that in a separate one, selection, store selection. There you go. We now have, you see how this stored copy had the selection here, and then here we don't have it anymore. All right, so now we are simply getting our attention to the outside. And what I wanted to do is simply add a little bit more of another elevation, more like the alpine regions, higher peaks alteration there. So I'm going to do some plasma noise on top of that. And that is not going to be a replace mode. I'm going to say whenever the plasma is higher than those soft rolling hills, let's show them. So that's if it's greater than. So now we have some parts where it's actually sticking out. Right, these parts here was about the same or lower, but this part here is going to be sticking out. And so that way you do a couple of renders until you have a nice mix of what might be some nice higher elevation mountains. Maybe seamless if you want it. Try a few times until you get something that looks fairly decent. Maybe that seamless is actually preventing it a little bit. Let's go. Oh, that looks almost there. There, something like this. All right, so we have an elevation map for the outside higher elevations, and then the darker areas here. If I clear this, you see this is a little bit darker, but has those bright spots, those stars that are going to turn into spiky elevation blips that, if they are properly colorized, will look like trees. They could, of course, look like some rocky monolith or just an aberration of some sorts. All right, so that's a very starting point. You can, of course, also further reduce the intensity or the brightness on this if you think this is too bright of an elevation, because it's almost competing with these high hills or peaks on the mountains there. So what you could do is simply go back to the airbrush, like one of the large airbrushes, and use a very low amount of opacity here to not overdo it too much, and then with the right button erase, or with the left button, well, that depends on what the colors are. Oh yeah, see, I still have that bluish color here. So let's set that color back to black, and then that way, as you're let's do undo, there you go, as you're painting over this, you're essentially reducing very softly the elevation of these spikes, but they're still going to be there, right? So the idea is to let you have some of that without having too much of that. Just the right amount of fun. All right, so let's see, this elevation map is still plain like this. What you could do now also is turn that into a color map for the green coloring. Let's do a very quick one on that. I'm simply going to go store this copy there, and then I have a stored copy that I'm going to use as a basis for the elevation, right? And so one way to do that is, of course, with the filter, stylize, and use the slope shading. Now the problem is that, oh yeah, no, it actually selects a nice mid-range for the green or the lower parts. We have the snow caps we can have in the higher elevation for these mountains, and then over here we have the green that we can reduce to contain it here. But you see those gray blobs? Those also are supposed to be green, right? The gray, that's the transition on the elevation, is one thing, but then we also should have the trees themselves in a green, maybe a different green, maybe a dark green. So whatever is gray here, we could actually make that the dark green, right? So let's go to the rock region and say we want that to be green, but a little bit more on the dark side, something like this, and perhaps a little bit, maybe it's a certain type of tree, like a pine tree with a bit of a bluish tint to it as well. And so, okay, so that was the wrong one. That was the one on the outside. No, actually it's the right one, right? We see, if we do this, we now see the coloration on the spikes, those starry blotches that we've painted, and that should help make the trees look like they are actually made of something green. And for us, that will probably look a bit like trees. So we have a texture map. Let's go store that. We have an elevation map. Let's go put this in there. Let's go to the elevation map. Actually, I don't know, was that the right one? Yep, no, that's the right one. Well, this really should be a grayscale. This time we can turn it into a grayscale. Expose through lens. Something like this. We can also still add more erosion to that too, right? Which will help in a couple of places. In the mountain regions here, we didn't put erosion yet. And then over here on the trees, it will add some extra randomness to those spikes, right? If we like that. So let's go perhaps add one more time the stylized erosion, and this time do a little bit more. Let's do 23, and do a little bit longer. Let's do 2000, and the viscosity is fine. Flash, maybe this one here we can do 22. All right, so with that we have a little bit of an erosion map. Let's go store that. Here's our erosion map. Let's restore the elevation map that we had. Let's make sure we grab a safe copy of that as well, and because this one here still had the colored, yeah, let's go get rid of that. So we have the elevation map here. Now we have the erosion map. We can simply subtract it from the elevation, and that will add extra depth, gullies and carved channels. You can adjust how much of that you want. You can also adjust, in fact, before you carve it out, let's go store this. Before you carve it out, you might want to minimize these. We don't need those. Before you carve it out, you might want to even blur it out a little bit, kind of a white diffusion, to make it a bit more of a soft erosion, like a larger valley erosion. So you can do the blur or the white light diffusion. That would be very nice. Actually, not on this, but just on the elevation map, on the erosion map here. Let's go to File, to Filter, Photographic Filter, Light Diffusion, and make sure we're on the light diffusion. So you see now how it's doing a little bit of a widening of this. Let me zoom in so it's easier to see right here. So if you see, that's the original erosion map, and now I'm going to go to the photographic filter, light diffusion, and so now at this time you see how it's widening those white paths, and that's essentially going to provide more of an erosion path. The gullies are going to be wider, not at full intensity though. That's going to be in the very middle of it, but it's softening out to the outside, and you can adjust the bias, or you can adjust the level of that. Or you could do that and then do some interactive undo to go between all or nothing, between those two levels, right? And what you probably will want to do is really do this 2 or 3 times till you have a fairly decent level of white diffusion. Let's go something like this. Okay, so we have now an erosion map that may be more interesting to use. Let's store it and restore. That's this one here. Restore the elevation map and erode it by, or subtract the erosion map this way. Again, maybe not that much. A lot of erosion happened there. Let's give it sort of a little middle ground there. And now you have something with some extra erosion. But we still have those spokes, and that's what we wanted, those tree-like structures there. All right, so that's an idea, right? This is sort of some of the techniques you can use to create more and more sophisticated and interesting looking elevation maps, and behind that have the color maps as well. And you can always do more. You can always add a little bit of, I don't know, some blurriness to that, like motion blur even. Motion blur, something like this, and again do an interactive undo so that it's not doing all of it, but maybe only a little bit, kind of a ghost image on top of the original, and that will add a little bit of extra striage, or whatever you want, striants or streaks, whatever you want to call it, that might look interesting. See those little blurry filaments there? That will add there too. That will look like there's something going on in that grass. And by the way, if you want that light grass here to be also textured of some sort, at the time you render it in PuppyRay, you'll be able, of course, to add a bump map to that. But if you want, you can also do the selection here one more time, right? Select by color key and select the light green. And again, we don't need those marching ants, so let's go turn them off. There's a lot of details. It takes too long to render that, so let's do without it. But we do know that we have selected the light green, so we can add some extra fill settings here. fill some extra material. Something like we'll go to the pattern fill mode, but we'll need to select the pattern, and that pattern is something like this, or something like let's see what else we have. We have some organic looking patterns. Some of them look like grass, seen from the top. There, patterns of paper textures, stones. There's a lot of those. You might want to mix 2 or 3 of them actually. Right, so something like this might be useful for some extra patterns. Let me see if I can find one with grass. There's some grass. Okay, some extra coloring and some texturing with that. So I'm going to use that, and I'm going to use that in a mode which is going to keep some of the original green, but multiply. There you go. So hit the Q on the keyboard, or go to Image, Fill, Q. That's the fill mode. That's a little bit too dark. Okay, let's go do an undo. Very easy, interactive undo, and kind of do a little bit of both. Now that's great for the coloring, but it looks even greater if we add that also to the height map. Right, so as we are still on the color map, let's switch with the same selection mask still in place. Let's switch to the elevation map, and on the main buffer, and because here we were on the swap image, you can see here that's the swap buffer, the swap image, and so here we are on the elevation map, and it's pretty dark because it's low elevation, but I can use that Q command perhaps in an additive mode, perhaps in a multiply mode, perhaps in a screen mode. A couple of these will be really useful, or even in a rub through mode. Right? If you do a Q for that, it's going to copy through or rub through the image that you have on the color map. But so it's showing some green, and we don't want that much of it, so we'll just do a little bit of it. And then another way would be, instead of a rub through, would be a multiply or a screen mode. Again, hit Q to make that happen, and do a very little bit of that, only like 5 or 10 out of 255. So it's a very soft change on the elevation map. Let's go and clear that, and so we now have probably the elevation map we'll want. If we want to animate through that, I'm going to go and first of all store it. That's the elevation map we want, and we have a color map. Let's store that one. So we have a height map, we have a color map. We had a couple of erosion maps. We don't need them anymore. We can minimize those. In fact, we don't need those older elevation maps. We can minimize those. One thing I encourage you to do, by the way, is do a puppy ray render for each of those as you progress through your discovery, as you try things for the first time, right? So here we go. Maybe one more thing we could do is a little bit of dark diffusion, so that the darker colors kind of bleed over to the lighter colors. Do a photographic soft contrast improvement. That's probably a little bit too much of it. Let's adjust that. And then you can also do a photographic light diffusion, but switch to the dark side here, the dark diffusion, and make it a precise. Doesn't need a whole lot, but it's good to have a little bit of that blurry transition on the coloration, almost like there's dirt from, like, dust and sand and grime that the wind blew into the wider, brighter parts of the terrain, snow or whatever it might be. All right, so we do that. We store that as our latest current texture map. Always take time to save that on file as well. And then we are almost ready. We have the elevation map. We could do a few more things there with contrast, with light diffusion, whatever your heart desire. There's a lot of filters to create a lot of different effects if you use it as an elevation map or as a texture map or as both. You might even want to use that as the sky map, right? So I'm going to go and actually copy that entire selection. Let me make sure it's clear. Let's go and select the entire selection as the brush, and that will make me a static image that I can use and store here as the brush from the brush menu, store and manage a copy. And I could change it into different colors. I could go and hue saturation value. I could perhaps add a little bit of red, green, blue here, reduce the green. And so we get more of a coloration that you might expect to see in the sky, like reddish, a little bit of bluish. Add that. and there's some darks. And that's a brush, so we can preview it here with the little eye, and you can see it's very unopaque. Let's go make it fully opaque. And that brush, you could add some blurriness to that. You can resample it. You can do a number of things. If you have it as a animated brush, right now we don't. Right now we have just one image here. So I'm gonna go and add itself to it. Right, add frames. So several times I'm going to click on add frames, so I have a whole sequence of images here, and that's therefore now an animated brush. I can hide the film strip, or I can keep it there for a while. And as an animated brush, I have now permission to go here to the animated, excuse me, not to the filters, but under the brush menu to the animated brush. Right, and I can load the timeline, the animated brush timeline, where in the animated brush timeline you get to see each of the images you have here and do other transforms on that as well. So for instance, I could say color add to reduce the green even more, add a little bit of blue, so we have some bluish starting to show here, actually perhaps even a little bit of greenish, and more red, all sorts of different coloring effects you can have with that. Let's go and apply that, render, and then keep that render to keep going with some more effects there. Maybe the tint, maybe we want to change the tint a little bit, or maybe what's the value adjustment there, the brightness of the sky, the darkness of it, the contrast. And see these trees, they actually now look a bit like stars. So there's a double whammy here. We can use that in several ways. Let's keep this render. The purple is still too much on the pink side, so I'm going to go hue saturation value. Let's change the hue until we see something we like better. Something like this perhaps. Yeah, some reddish sky colors. Saturation, we could increase it or decrease it, brighter values. There you go. Let's use that render and keep this render. I know we need to reduce something on the blue here, or not. I mean, we can keep that as is. There's a lot of things you can do, just like in the regular timeline. There's many filters here, not quite that many, but we can do mystic vision and adjust a little bit, some sort of a some sort of a blurriness to it. Adjust that. Okay, and we now have probably something really interesting that we should use. So I'm going to go copy here and use the brush, the destination as the brush, and store that brush. You see it here. Let's go make it actually a little bit wider. Resample that to let's say 1280 we'll keep, but do a 4:1 ratio, so 4 times wider. That's 640 divided by 2, it's 320. So we're going to have a 320 high and a width of 1280. And then that way we have a brush image that's perfect almost for the background sky. We might want to make one more time, make sure it's seamless. So go to the brush menu here and say make seamless. And especially in the horizontal overlap. The vertical doesn't matter so much because we're not going to look up to the zenith at the top over our heads. So if there is a bit of a cut there, that doesn't matter. We also will not see the bottom of the horizon. That will be below the fog level. So it's okay not to worry about the vertical overlap, but the spread horizontally, we want to make sure we have a nice transition there. And you could go to the point where you really cannot tell where that is. Something like this. Alright, so we have this. Let's go store that as our new brush. Brush, store, and manage a copy. This one we don't need anymore. This one here is still a single image because that's all we kept. But what we want to do is use this as the sky background in our puppy ray render. That's why we built this particular image there on top. We can still adjust now the hue, the saturation, the value. So if you like a more bluish background there and then some whitish clouds, that's an easy way to do that. Hue, saturation, right? Lots of different resulting appearances from that. If you want a really dark sky, something like this, or a really bright sky, something like that. And if you want now less or more red, you can still do that. Less or more green, right? Something like that. And the blue just the same. Now, you don't want green in the sky. So, all right, so we have that. That's our sky image. We will use that. Let's see. Let's go minimize, hide the film strip, and minimize this. So we have a little spot here to keep that in mind. That's our sky image. And we could always blur it and do tons of other things as long as it is accessible through the animated timeline editor, right? Or otherwise you put it back into the regular animation and work from that. Anyway, let's go turn this preview off. We know we have the brush image holding the sky. We know we have the elevation map held inside the main image buffer here. That's what we see here is the main image. And then as we switch over to here, we see the elevation map, the color map in the swap. So we have basically the elements we need for Puppy Ray to be happily rendering, happily ever after. So what we'll do is this time I'll switch it over to the left, and I'll go to the filter, transform, Puppy Ray GPU. And remember this old rendering we had? Now let's do a re-rendering of exactly the same view. Look how different that looks. And what you notice here in particular is that there are some spikes. Those could be looking like trees if we make them a little bit more dense. We also have some alterations on the sky, of course, and on the terrain itself with the higher alpine looks. But here are those things that I wanted to make them look a little bit like trees. It's a very futile attempt at this point here. I didn't really do a whole lot good yet with those trees, but it gives you at least the techniques that you can explore. If you do want to make it look like there are some pieces of foliage and trees nearby, it could be a starting point. Now let's add the water plane. And when you do that, you'll possibly like it even more because you might see reflections of that, but it's a little bit too high, the water. Now we don't adjust the height of the water, we adjust the height of the terrain. So the world you can see here, you can move the world with the right button, you can move it up or down, right? So you'll have some of these trees stick out. And you can go back to move the camera and go out or in front. With the right button you can move above the terrain. Let's say here is also the camera zoom. You can move that camera a little bit wider to get a better idea of what else you're looking at. The sky is still one of the presets. Let's go pick our sky. That's this one here. All right, so now we have our sky. That's the terrain's elevation map up there, right? Or the color map. But it's also very suitable as a sky for very fancy appearance in a different planet, right? Here is the sun that we can also move around with the sun moving the light, right? So we could have that one. We could have that one bigger too if you want to make it look like 300 here is very big for the sun, but why not? And then we can move our camera a little bit to the left, something like this. So we see the reflection, but now it's certainly time to make sure that we also have some refraction. So enable that, and then the water becomes transparent. Now maybe it's not deep enough. We need to have a little bit more of that murky. Here, go to the World tab and enable murky. It's already there, but we don't get to see much because the water is barely any deep. There's barely any depth to it. So we need to move the water down, move the world down, but we don't want the trees to disappear under the water, so we also need to scale it up. Scale the world, that's with the left button up. So you see it go up. Find the middle ground where it's good between having deep water and having some trees still visible, and you'll be exactly where you want to be with that. Alright, so here is some really fancy stuff. Now we can also adjust a little bit those spiky trees. Let's do a quick render at better quality. These might be a little bit too spiky, or just the way you want it, but you can adjust with the pre-filter here. You can smooth that a little bit. The other thing too, though, is that they don't show much texture, and I mentioned earlier we can add some bumps. So that's over here in the render tab. You have the bump map, and take some time to experiment with them. The fractal looks really good, but there's a little bit too much brightness, the reflection here. So you might want to go to the world and reduce how much specularity you have here. That's really a trade-off between how much you want on the trees versus the ones that represent rock. You could have the hardness a little bit higher, or softer actually, and then simply reduce the specularity to 11-ish or something like that. So a lot of different results depending on how you set these values. All right, so here I'm going to go to try a few of the other bump maps. You have fractal, you have rocky, you have this looks pretty good too actually. You have pitted, and sometimes you need to adjust the size of those. Alright, and there is of course a couple of other modes. Mud, let's see if we render with that. That looks pretty diversified for those trees too. Mud bank, riverbed, a little bit more rockiness to that, also very interesting at times. And tech, probably not so much. Well, unless you're into technology styles for the for the trees. The hull, no, more of a spaceship hull. Perlin might have a little bit of a value there too. Yeah. So, there's a couple of ways to make this look somewhat more passable as trees without sophisticated editing of the height map. And of course we only took a first stab here at the height map, so we can do much better. What I'm gonna do is see if I can get a bit of a interesting place, get the sun to go to the back there, make it a little bit smaller, let's say 222. There you go, make it go up a little bit higher. So we should get some interesting lighting there, maybe a little bit brighter. The green is dark, so that's good, but we have to perhaps compensate a little bit there. And I don't know if I do like that sky after all. Well, it's got its merits, it's got some potential there. So what I'm gonna do next is simply to get out of this, cancel it, and turn this into an animation. And let's say we do just a short one, let's say 234 frames. That's going to be at 24 frames a second. It's going to be it's going to be almost 10 seconds long. And so all we got to do now is go right back into PuppyRay, and it still remembers all these parameters. And let's see, are we ready? We could do, well, I don't know that we created the paths yet, so let's do clear the keyframes, and then start with a keyframe, something like so. You know what, let's go down, deep, close to the water, something like this. Okay. And then we'll just like turn slightly to the side. Oops, that's moving, not moving. Turning is what I want. There, turn the camera over. And all the while the water height should be a little bit higher, a little bit more pronounced. That will give it some nice dynamic appearance. Probably a little bit more on the frequency as well. Let's give it 33. And perhaps a little bit more on this one, let's say 1.7, just a little bit of variety of waves and some multi-frequency on top of that, which we will see makes an impact when we have multiple passes for anti-aliased rendering. And let's see, I think that's about it. Let's go to keyframe that, and then we'll go to the last position here and rotate a little bit further, but also go like this and move up a little bit. Kind of see the horizon. I want to see more, so let's take the level further back so we see more of that distant landscape. And it's very bright here, but that's because it's snow. It's white, and we set the world to be a little bit specular more than the usual. Let's in fact make it pretty specular like this. And the hardness, though, we want to give it a little bit more value there. So with that, perhaps the illumination can change a little bit down. Perhaps the sun can go up. Let's go click the sun and bring this light even higher. There you see some nice shadows that will add some nice dynamic movement. Let's see, what else could we possibly do to this? The scattering, perhaps a little bit thicker. Attenuation 0.7. Caustics, we didn't do the caustics yet. My oh my, shame on me. Let's do 5. And so we'll get a little bit of light dancing in the water here where the trees right here. See this? There's some light spots there. If we over exaggerate that, let's say 12, that might just make it a little bit too intense. Let's keep it at about 5. 5 is a good number. We got 5 fingers on our hands for a good reason. Groundhog. That's called the golden rule, I think. Not groundhog, ground fog. That looks good. We can give it a little bit of a foggy look here. Let's give it just 3. See what that does. That's actually going up a little bit more. Let's give it 12. That's nice. I like that. Let's give it. Let's see what if we have 22. That's very low. Let's give it 8. I'd like to see some of the trees here partly bathing in that fog. So that's good. And you know, perhaps just one more look to the right here. That's interesting. So maybe what we'll do is we'll keep it like this and keyframe that. So we have a final look here. Any place else we look, we will see some of these tree-like structures here. And that will be interesting. So now let's see what happens if we do a high quality render. That should be looking better, more refined. We had 6 passes of anti-aliasing. Let's go to 36. Or you know what, you could go to final render with that. And